You went to Philadelphia for the weekend.
Yeah, it was really awesome. We went to Independence Mall.
And for those who don't know, what's Independence Mall?
So Independence Mall was where the Declaration of Independence was announced and read. Wasn't it like signed there?
Well, and the Constitution was written in Independence Hall, like right there. Right there.
Right.
And you can go in and see like where they deliberated over the Constitution. Just right there.
George Washington and John Adams lived there, right?
During their presidencies.
During their presidency. And so the Liberty Bell's there. And so we learned, even though my kids are kind of over museums because that's all they've done. Mm-hmm. So the older ones are like, here we go with another museum.
No, but this part of American history, that is one of my favorite spots.
Deal. They really liked it. They liked seeing things that we had talked about.
Yeah.
And then even knowing like, whoa, it was only for like 10 years and it was here. Because we've been to D.C. multiple times.
People forget that Philly was the nation's capital for a short time because George Washington, one of his first things was like, you know what we should do? We should build a capital city. Wouldn't that be great? Right. And then he picked like this horrible swamp area.
Yeah.
And built Washington, D.C., but they had to build it before they could live there.
Yeah. But in all of this and celebrating the Liberty Bell and the meaning behind Liberty Bell and the history and all that, there was one thing that was unexpected. What threw me was right on the steps of the Liberty Bell was President George Washington's quarters where he kept 9 slaves.
I didn't know it was there. I've been there, and since I've been there, it's been put together. I didn't even know it was a thing.
Looking at the Liberty Bell, seeing how abolitionists actually made it a thing. They were the ones, when we were learning about how it started and how, because of different moments, it was rang, like during independence or calling the Founding Fathers to meetings. But then eventually, abolitionists kept pushing and saying, if we're going to keep pushing for liberty and freedom, this bell that you're making about liberty should represent liberty for all and freedom for all.
The way that I look at it when I hear this conversation come up is how many of those slaves were exposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ, period.
It sounds like what you're saying. I don't think you're saying this. It sounds like it's not so bad because at least they heard about Jesus.
We always look at our past and other people about the evils that's happened, like George Washington having buying slaves. Back in those days, they didn't have medical procedures to kill the people before they were born. And so all those people that were unwanted were born and put into the world. And for George Washington to take in 9 people and to keep them alive, that could be considered a good thing rather than to kill them.
Are you saying, Joe, that like he was almost doing them a favor by having them as slaves?
Well, someone was going to own them. Someone was going to buy them and feed them and give them a house to live in. Or we could do as we do today and just kill them.
Our country's story is filled with people trying to make slavery not sound so bad because it's such a big scar. So you'll hear things like, oh, well, you know, that he was real nice to him, you know? Which tries to kind of minimize the fact that they were literally property. And I'm not comfortable with that. One of the most controversial things I've ever said on the radio, and it was me daring to say that the 3/5 compromise was bad. Now, historically speaking, the 3/5 compromise is what enabled us to have the Constitution, because there was no way to reconcile the slave states versus free states, even in revolutionary America. And so their compromise they made was they're like, well, all right, so we're figuring out the House of Representatives thing. You can count a slave as 3/5 of a person. That's embarrassing. I'm glad we fixed that and got rid of that in the Constitution. It's good that we got rid of it. But we try to make it sound better. And this is what happened when I talked about this years ago when the show first started. I brought up the 3/5 compromise. And people tried to make it sound better.
Right.
By giving all the yeah buts. There's some times where you're right. Like when it comes to sin, don't say any yeah buts. All you say is, it was wrong. I mean, it was wrong. And as Christians, when we start turning people into flawless individuals, especially our founding fathers, we're telling a lie about the gospel.
History is not neat. It's complicated and messy. It's about people, places, and events that are both admirable and deplorable. That's what history is. You're telling the story of people just like us. We're messy and admirable and great and sinners all in one.
And yet, in the midst of that, it's one of the most controversial things to discuss.
You know what we're about to do? We're about to get real. We're about to have conversations that Christians have behind closed doors, the scary, raw ones, the ones that make you feel uncomfortable. That's where we're going. Why? Because we're family. Ustedes son mi familia.
So this is the Brian and Janelle podcast. She's Janelle and I'm Brian. And if you don't want to miss anything, all you got to do is just hit subscribe and get that notification whenever we drop a new episode. This is the Brian and Janelle podcast.
This part of President George Washington's living quarters, and it was kind of like underground where he kept 9 of his slaves. And so these are slaves that he transported from Vernon. He had like hundreds in Vernon, which is like
Mount Vernon was his
Mount
plantation,
Vernon.
basically.
Right.
Yeah.
So he brought 9 of them to Philadelphia. But there were a couple things that impacted me. One was in the memorial, the fact that they listed their names. That just, I was like, wow. So they humanized it. And I know you can't go back and fix it. But the fact that they made a point to research and not just say, oh, yeah, he held 9 slaves kind of helps fix the wrongs. It just helps to see the name. So I took a picture of that.
You see his name all the time.
Yeah. And these were people that left babies behind or that had a story. There were actually, if you read on them, there's like stories to them. One of them was this cook, and the other one was like an assistant to Martha Washington. Yeah. And she was going to be gifted to Martha Washington's daughter. And when she found that out, she escaped. But it just helps me. It checks me on like, wow, these were like humans. They weren't just numbers. It's not just like, oh, slaves and just grouping them together.
But see, when I had never heard of this. And when I started doing some research on it, and I found this article that when the exhibit opened in 2010, it gave some more detail on those 2 stories. And it's a side of Washington that you don't really hear very often. Like the side I heard was the one where he couldn't tell a lie about some cherry tree.
Right.
And I've heard some really great stories too. Like he established the executive branch. Many of the traditions we have today, like the president's cabinet, some of these things were established by his political brilliance. I mean, he was able to squelch a rebellion. One of the most dramatic moments in American history, in one of my favorite paintings in the nation's capital, in the Rotunda, is the moment he resigned his position as the head of the Continental Army and tried to go back to Mount Vernon.
Right.
Because in all of world history prior to that moment, when the conquering army wins, the general takes over.
Right.
People wanted him to be king, and he refused it.
Yeah.
And so he's got all these incredible qualities, but like you were talking about, so Martha Washington, 17-year-old slave, Oni Judge, she escaped when she learned she was going to be given as a wedding gift.
Yeah.
It's like, what? The first lady was going to give a person as a wedding gift? And then
I wonder what the impetus was if she thought that the lifestyle would be worse. I mean, because she could have escaped any time. Why she chose that moment, why that knowledge was enough to push her over the brink and say, I'm going to take the chance.
I can give you an idea. I was talking to a friend of mine who also homeschools on the way here because I was just so impacted by this. And she was like, wow, that's interesting. Her kids and her went through some of the diaries left behind by Washington, President Washington, and even some of these slaves. And she said he had promised them that after, I guess he got to a point in his life where he felt worse and worse. about it. And he had promised them, I will let you free when I die. Or when I die.
Yeah.
And so
That's pretty
he
common.
passed away and they were still there. And so Martha told them, like she kept the promise going. So I think it was that realizing, oh my goodness, you're going to gift me to your daughter, so it's going to keep going.
Oh, so you won't be set free. I get
Right.
it.
So, and
How about this?
eventually they actually were. The promise was completed, but it took longer than they expected.
But then another one I uncovered, and you mentioned real quickly, his cook, President Washington's cook named Hercules, which awesome name.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
So he was cooking for the president. But there was this obscure Philadelphia law, like this Pennsylvania law, that if you were an enslaved African in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania for more than 6 months, you're free.
Oh, wow.
So what
Wow.
did President Washington do? Sent him back before the 6 months were up
Oh, no.
to avoid having to make him free. So he sent him back, and while he sent him back, Hercules escaped.
Good for him.
But think about that.
He probably broke his chains.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Hercules. Yeah.
But that's it. Like, I shall not tell a lie. It's like he found a loophole. Basically, he didn't break the
Yeah.
law in that particular case. But it's like, wow, okay, so you didn't altruistically say, I'm a guy who advocates freedom, so it's just about 6 months. You're free.
Yeah.
He quickly sent him back so he wouldn't have to let him go.
Right.
That's a whole different side of a guy that
Yeah.
I never heard about.
And so that's where I wanted to go. I understand, even though I learned it the way it was presented to a lot of Americans here in terms of history, when I looked at the courts, I was proud. I was like, wow, that's cool. I am so glad that we're finally getting to the point where we're telling the entirety of history, all of it, good, bad, and just learning to love people. That's what we do with people, and so we should teach our kids. That's how you should do with the people you admire. Admire them and still acknowledge, yeah, they messed up, or even if it's our country, etc. But then I find out, so what I thought was that they put it up and said, no, this is important. Let's tell the whole history. But then when I looked at how it was decided to include this as part of the whole independent small thing, it was actually something that was brought up by activists and was pushed back. And so the activists had to kind of like work for it.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of me is like, why? Like, why is it that historians, people, organizations are still uncomfortable with presenting the entirety of history, which is real? It's true. It's things that actually happen. We know it happened. So it wasn't a discussion on, well, hold up, let's go back and make sure. We know it happened, but we're uncomfortable with presenting it.
And you want to know why.
Right.
I think it's a good
The
question.
Bible's not like that.
Right.
We're not uncomfortable with that.
We have the Old Testament is a big mess, one after another, of people God used despite their messiness.
But
Right.
but I think people are uncomfortable with the messiness in the Bible. There's a lot of people who don't even read the Old Testament. They just focus on the new one.
or
That's true.
your Sunday school lessons kind of skip over a lot, and it's like, well, Samson, he was a good guy.
He's real
and
strong.
Then he
Yeah.
made a few bad decisions, and he had to knock down the pillars to kill all the
When
Philistines.
the real story is disturbing.
Yeah.
And I can't even believe it's a children's story. When you read it, you're like, oh my goodness, what is this?
Well, let
or
me-
David. All
Oh
we do is
my
talk
goodness,
about him
yes.
killing Goliath. Like, oh, he's so brave. Yay, it's brave David. It's brave
Yeah.
David. Or he's a peeping Tom that had someone murdered.
Yeah.
Like, why are we so uncomfortable? And I think
guess
it's a good question.
maybe we're uncomfortable. But I'm like, wow, our Lord is obviously not. Like, he presented in putting the Bible together. Even the disciples are a mess.
Yep.
And so maybe that shows our sinfulness, where it's like, well, the Lord was like, no, y'all need to stop being uncomfortable. Here's all of it. And yeah, and so I want to discover, even within us, why is it that we're still not at that point?
Where we can examine America's scars
Yes.
without suppressing them, basically. In that portion of Philadelphia that is packed with history, where on
it's
one
amazing.
in one area you've got the Liberty Bell, then you've got Independence Hall, you got all this rich history. I went there as a kid,
Yeah.
and what you saw that impacted you the most wasn't there when I was a kid. In fact, I've got an article right in front of me that from when it opened in 2010, so 9 years ago, we finally acknowledged that in that same place, within steps of where the Constitution was established, was the home where George Washington, at the time President George Washington, held his 9 slaves.
Right.
And for those who want to know the history of it, 1790 to 1800 is when Philadelphia was our nation's capital. So while he lived there, he had 9 slaves in the basement, basically. And now that's finally memorialized there. And you didn't even know about it. You saw it, and you're wondering, why do we have such a hard time with this? Why do we work so hard to hide our nation's scars?
Right. And what my favorite thing about the memorial is that there's a mural with all 9 names, which I think is like super awesome. And so, yeah, I'm struggling with why can't we admit and openly talk about the admirable and deplorable parts of the people that we look back on and learn about. Anonymous, good morning. You're on the air.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for taking my call. Yeah, I just tuned in here a few minutes ago and was listening. And, when we look back in history, it's easy for us to sit here and say, that we would never do things like that.
Yeah.
But, we're all capable of it.
Mm-hmm.
And this, what was accepted back then is obviously not accepted now. But what would we have done in that same situation?
Yeah, we'd like to think we would have been abolitionists, but we don't know because we can't go back into the context of that moment. You're absolutely right. But does that what do you do then with the scars of our history? Like, should we stare at them? I mean, should we ignore them? What do we do?
No, I agree. We definitely need to look at them. We need to learn from them.
Mm-hmm.
But to just ignore them and act like nothing happened or act like everything was completely evil, I don't think that's right either. I think, there was a lot of good. There was a lot of things that were accepted that were wrong. They were wrong. That's true. And we need to look at that, and we also need to realize that we are all capable of doing the most evil things that anybody in history has ever done.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's only by the grace of God that we're not there.
Amen. No, and I think that's one of the reasons God has all of those situations in the Old Testament of people making horrible mistakes, is to remind us that we are sinners, all of us. Even the best among us are sinners.
Mm-hmm.
And we desperately need God's forgiveness.
Yes.
Great point.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your show very much. Thank you.
Thanks for joining in. We love having the conversation with you.
Oh, yeah.
Ross in Cleveland, good morning. You're on the air.
Good morning. I was always taught in school that the reason we have history is so it doesn't repeat itself.
Yes.
Even though, that's why we got to have the bad things in history. A lot of the people that, go back to slavery, people that had slavery, but some of them people that we have in our history books is the reason we don't have slavery today. They were the first ones to give it up.
Yeah, and your connection is bad enough. Sorry, my friend, I can't keep talking to you, but I get where you're coming from. Yeah, it's the idea that we talk about the mistakes of history so that we aren't condemned to repeat them ultimately. But we still, we tell our story with rose-colored glasses as well.
Yes.
I mean, when I was a kid, when you talk about Thanksgiving, we all make little turkeys and talk about how the Pilgrims invited the Indians to their party.
Right.
And the reality of the fact that they barely made it and they wouldn't have made it without the help of the Native Americans. And that's why they had a party.
Right.
There's a whole different story. I remember the attitude of it was like, oh, those cute Indians, we'll invite them to our party.
Yeah.
And that was not it. And so, there's part of me that goes, why was I lied to about that? In fact, the book it's called Lies My Teacher Told Me. It was something I read in my training to be a history teacher. Is how often we have this tendency to use rose-colored glasses and just slightly twist what happened to make it look a little bit better.
Right.
Yeah.
But we all do that personally, don't we?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you always try to make yourself look a little better than you are.
Yeah. I could talk to you about Sarah and my first anniversary trip to Europe. Doesn't that sound romantic?
Yeah,
first anniversary,
awesome.
we met in Europe, and oh, wow, it's like a movie. Except we also got in one of the biggest fights we've ever gotten in with in our whole life, in our whole marriage there, like a devastating argument. So which do I talk about in hindsight?
Right.
I mean, I don't want to emphasize the fight,
Right.
but we learned a lot from that fight.
Right. Yeah, and I look back at my experiences in history classes, and it's like you said, no, that like there are things I didn't hear about about these things, or even the things like you said that we covered. Christopher Columbus. There were a whole lot of things that were not told, that were lied about, and that's fine because I'm not a historian. So I'm just saying it's a lot more complex to write history. I get that. There's something in us that's afraid to say, well, yeah, there was all this good stuff, but you know what? There was also this. I'm a homeschooler. I get it. And so part of me says, how do you walk that line? The perfect example, if we want to take it more personal, how do I sit with my teen and say, these are the things that you should do and these are the things that you should follow. But when I was your age, I messed up. I did this, X, Y, Z. You should still respect me. You should still kind of try to follow the things I'm teaching you. Like, how do you not lose credibility by still being honest on like all your stuff? You're a Christ follower. You love the Lord, but you messed up. Still follow me. Do you get it? Like,
Yeah.
I know it's difficult, but we're not doing it right. And what are we missing out on when we don't look at the entire history?
We're just discussing the tendency in history, first of all, but also in our own lives, to want to ignore and hide our scars. And why do we do that? And should we do that?
maybe the heart of it is that when we talked about authenticity about 3 weeks ago, we were just talking about the difficulty of being authentic is the fear of losing credibility. You know, as a leader, for example, you could be a
Yes.
pastor or a Bible study teacher or a parent, and you're afraid to show who you really are because you may, as an authority leader or as a leader, period, you may lose credibility. So maybe that's where some of that is. Do we feel, is that part of why we try to hide things from the people that we admire historically?
I don't know. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but people would presume one of the most controversial subject area for like developing state standards in education would be like science, right? It's not.
Okay.
It's history.
What?
Without a doubt, across the country, it's super controversial because how do you tell the story? Who gets to control the narrative?
I
Which
thought
parts
there
do
was
you
like
emphasize?
agreement overall,
No.
except for small groups of activists.
No.
What are the disagreements? Seriously.
On this very issue.
Oh, that's good to know.
On what do you do with the scars? Now, when you move up further along into studying of history, it becomes one of the greatest and most interesting things to do is to debate hero or villain
Yeah.
of history. You take a controversial figure and you talk about what they contributed to society and their flaws, and you decide were they a hero or a villain. For example, Martin Luther.
I don't even know if you've brought that up recently, but we've talked about it. I had no idea.
Well, because
Then what do you do with him?
he had a long list of incredible contributions.
Right.
He's in terms of the Protestant Reformation, that's like a chapter in a world history book.
Yeah.
It changed the world.
Yeah.
And
And
very
yet-
courageous.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Yes, I love that.
And one of my favorite speeches was his refusal to recant his works at the Diet of Worms.
Mm-hmm.
He said, "My conscience is captive to the Word of God." Powerful stuff. But if you read his writings later in his life about the Jews, you'd be horrified.
Yeah.
And if you knew that Adolf Hitler used some of Luther's writings,
Oh,
you'd be disturbed.
yeah.
But when I look at the scales of history, without a doubt, he's a hero.
Yeah.
I'm not going to ignore his past and I'm not going to not look at his bad writings. I think the same is true of George Washington.
Yeah.
Like his contributions to the world and to America far outweigh his scars.
Right.
But let's not turn him into the person that didn't lie.
Right.
He's the guy that had 9 slaves literally living in the nation's capital in his basement.
Right.
And he was dancing around laws to make sure they were held captive. And we shouldn't be embarrassed about this. We should call it what it is because he's a flawed person like
Right.
everybody else. And as Christians, when we start turning people into flawless individuals, especially our founding fathers, we're telling a lie about the gospel.
And I think our one caller was trying to point out too, we don't demonize them
No.
and say, well, they were horrible, evil evil
No.
people. They were living in the society of the day and going with the flow.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes you want to look in the mirror and say, okay, what am I going with the flow with today? That in 10, 15, 20 years, I'm going to look back and say, what was I thinking?
Yeah. And that's kind of the attitude we have to have. And yet, you hear it all the time, even in American culture today, this tension between, there are those who want to talk about how basically America's the worst thing ever. And we ought to own up to it. And others who say, what are you talking about? This is the best place in the world, and there's really nothing bad here.
Right.
Like, they're both wrong.
Right.
But why do we have such a hard time with the scars today?
And so I love to take my kids back home and rehash this and kind of be like, man, what does it mean about people today, or about our leaders today, or even looking back at people that they admire from the past and saying, these people also made mistakes.
Well,
let's talk about this person.
But somebody might tell you, why are you teaching your kids to hate America?
I want to teach my kids the truth. That's the thing. And my dad, who passed away, for those who don't know that, he was huge. Like, I would have loved for him to have conversations with you. Big time history. And he would be outraged when we would talk about Christopher Columbus. And
because your dad's Dominican,
He's
and
from
that's where he first landed, and
Yes.
the story of what happened with Dominican people
and
and the island of Hispaniola
like,
is
for
atrocious.
example, the Taínos, which were the natives in the Caribbean, were like completely exterminated in like the first 50 years. You know, so he would, which is my encouragement, if you don't homeschool, he would fill in the gaps for me. So when I would come home and talk about, oh yeah, Christopher Columbus, XYZ, he would say, yes, and this happened and this happened. So when we're teaching history, why do I teach my kids these things? It's because as we look back, I want to teach them the truth. And we've talked about, even for me, I was just talking to my 16-year-old on our ride here, and he's considering some things in dating. And I've told him, like, you know, I made this decision and I made a mistake here. Like, as I present myself to my children, I want to present the truth and not just the things that are good, because I just think that's biblical. Truth is important. Joe in Akron, good morning. You're on the air.
Hello, good morning.
Morning.
Yeah, we always look at our past and other people about the evils that's happened, like George Washington having buying slaves. Back in those days, they didn't have medical procedures to kill the people before they were born. And so all those people that were unwanted were born and put into the world. And for George Washington to take in 9 people and to keep them alive, that could be considered a good thing rather than to kill them.
Are you saying, Joe, that like he was almost doing them a favor by having them as slaves? I want to be sure I understand you clearly.
Well, evidently they were slaves. Now, someone was going to own them. So someone was going to buy them and feed them and give them a house to live in. Or we could do as we do today and just kill them. Which one is better?
Well, but though Joe, I understand what you're trying to say, but to kind of talk about this further, what do you do with the fact then that a couple of the slaves that were held in Philadelphia in his basement tried to escape? So it's not like it was a wonderful situation. They couldn't wait to stay. You know what I mean?
No, it wasn't. Definitely, this world is not a wonderful world. Jesus said, if you love this world, the love of the Father isn't even in you, because this world's so horrible. And what's going on is there's unwanted people all over the place. And today, can we look back at our senators and presidents in the last 40 years and talk about them the same way we talk about George Washington, because they allowed the murder of 60 million people?
I see the point you're trying to make now, Joe. Thank you so much for the call. I think what Joe is trying to point to is what you were indicating earlier. It's the idea of like, what are we going to be looked at when we become history? And there's in the future, and what will people say about us?
Right.
And one of those scars will be the rampant abortion today.
Right.
However, from my perspective in my chair here, I don't see it as a parallel to slavery.
Why not? Can you unpack that a little bit?
Because it's not that they were society's unwanted. They were society's property and captive.
Right.
That were taken from another continent and brought here and held in captivity. It's a little different than, it's not that we didn't know how to abort them, so we didn't. No. Slave owners wanted their slaves to have children so they could have more slaves.
Right.
But to the point that he's trying to make, that there's a parallel here in that abortion will be the scar of America in the future. Like, we're looking back on today. I can agree with that. I just can't see it as the parallel to the past. That's all.
Right.
Is that fair?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and that's where we have to be, like, we need to be outraged by sin, right? That's biblical. Yeah. And like you said, to look back with rose-colored glasses, even if, like, maybe it's more comfortable to hear it this way. For me to look back at some of my outright mistakes, let's take a simple one that's easy to share. I used to talk back to my mom, or there were times I lied. It's unbiblical to present that to my kids and be like, well, I really meant to do good, but I lied to my mom. But, like, to try to justify that, it's not right and it's not biblical. What's right is to say, this is what I did and it was wrong and it was a sin and I should have done better.
Yes.
And I'm honoring myself. I'm me. I want to be good and all that. So what I'm saying is we can honor our history and honor the people that we love and still, as Christ followers, call out sin. I think we do an injustice
with
to our
brutal honesty.
Yes. We want to be as good citizens, like a caller said, not repeat the mistakes of our past. We want our children to be good citizens, informed, and make good decisions. These are going to be future leaders of our country. I think we do them a disservice to not call out our mistakes and say, yeah, we could have done better.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, our country's story is filled with people trying to make slavery not sound so bad because it's such a big scar. Mm-hmm. So you'll hear things like, oh, well, that he was real nice to him. Which tries to kind of minimize the fact that they were literally property and bought and sold and whipped. And and I'm not comfortable with that. And it's the same as I've heard pastors try to teach on this other issue where it's one of the most controversial things I've ever said on the radio. And it was me daring to say that the 3/5 compromise was bad.
Yeah. Right.
And now someone's going to write to me today. I can guarantee it with that. Now, historically speaking, the 3/5 compromise is what enabled us to have the Constitution. Mm-hmm. Because there was no way to reconcile the slave states versus free states, even in revolutionary America and constitutional era. And so their compromise they made was they're like, well, all right, so we're figuring out the House of Representatives thing. You can count a slave as 3/5 of a person. Now, politically speaking, it was, if you want to look at it apart from the humanity of slavery, you can go, oh, okay, well, that was a creative compromise. But I can't get past the fact, personally and morally, that we declared African Americans at the time as a fraction of a person.
Right.
Right.
And so it's
even though it
inexcusable.
ended up being the means to the end of slavery ultimately, but
it was still a horrible compromise.
Right.
Yeah. And to try to make it sound better. I mean, I don't have any ideas what they should have done instead. Like, I don't have a better, I'm glad I wasn't there because I wouldn't have had a better idea.
Mm-hmm.
But
I can say unequivocally that it's a scar in America that we made an entire people a fraction of a person. Like, that's embarrassing. I'm glad we fixed that and got rid of that in the Constitution. It's good that we got rid of it. But we try to make it sound better. And this is what happened when I talked about this years ago when this show first started. I brought up the 3/5 compromise. And people tried to make it sound better.
Right.
By giving all the yeah buts.
Yeah.
There's some times where you're right. Like, when it comes to sin, don't say any yeah buts.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All you say is, it was wrong. I mean, it was wrong.
Yeah. There's for the rose-colored kind of look at slavery or holding 10 slaves, there's a meme that went around that I was like, wow, I've never looked at it this way. And it said, they didn't take slaves. They took doctors, teachers, storytellers, grandparents. You know, like when you realize, like, man, these were people with families. They're like in their, like, it just helps you realize, like, it's once you see it that way, it's difficult to say, well, you know, they ate well. What? No, like they were held against their will, and they had careers. They were intelligent people, and
It's really not that different from, you hear those horror stories of somebody keeping a child captive in their house
Right.
in a box or something or in a cage, going, well, they fed them.
hello.
I mean, come on, cut them a break. They had a TV in there in the cage. I mean, that's outrageous in a modern context, and in hindsight, it has to be too, because the display that Janelle saw when she was in Philadelphia, we can't escape the fact that, again, Martha Washington tried to give away one of these 9 slaves held in Philadelphia in this home, tried to give them away as a present.
Yeah.
Just think about that.
Mm-hmm.
And that because of all the circumstances around that, the slave decided the best option was to escape, which at the time could have been a death sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Or the fact that George Washington himself, President of the United States, sent his cook back to Mount Vernon because if he didn't want to dare cross the 6-month marker where he'd have to let him free, according to Pennsylvania law at the time.
Wow.
That should make you uncomfortable.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean that he wasn't a great president.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that his contributions far outweigh his scars. But we can't ignore the scars. Some good text messages rolling in.
Yeah. Someone texted in and said, "Good morning. What has been done has been done. Yes, wrong, and yes, we're ashamed. But this is the bigger picture. In that day, it was acceptable. So what did we do? People want to be accepted. So they done those things with their heads held high. Let's fast forward to today. Think about what is accepted today. Do you still want to be accepted? Will you live life the way the world chooses to live life just to be accepted?" But part of people keep saying it was accepted in those days. I mean, it was a law, and people knew while they did these things that it was wrong. It wasn't like, oh man, what were we doing? That was crazy. We didn't realize it. At the moment, there were like laws banning it. No.
Yeah, and there were still states that didn't allow it. But what's interesting is, like, isn't that making an excuse for it? Saying, well, but that was the way the culture was at the time. People didn't know better.
Right.
I don't know.
Is that making an excuse?
I kind of thought what he was saying is comparing to today. Like, it's accepted for somebody to just say, I don't want stretch marks. I'm going to go get rid of this baby.
Yeah.
Or, similar things. And what are we doing? Because it was accepted, although there were pockets of activism fighting against it and saying, all men are created equal, not all Caucasian men are created equal.
Yeah, so then talking about scars of the past, I think is what you're indicating, should motivate us to remove the scars of the present or address the scars of the present.
Right.
And to that point, I can certainly stand with that.
I
just don't want to make excuses for it.
Right.
Like it was objectively wrong biblically to have to do this.
That's like saying, like, and help me on air. Like, this is live where I'm having an issue. If we looked at the people today in some parts of the Middle East, let's say, and some of the atrociousness that's happening, let's say to women, and
especially.
like mob killings or raping of women, we don't think, like, would we be comfortable with someone saying, well, the people that are there, that's like a normal thing.
Like
they don't
culture.
realize that.
Leave them alone.
Isn't there a thing inside of people? When I look at pictures of people seeing lynching or seeing a hanging, like in the 1800s, part of me wonders, like, there has to be something in your heart that sees that and it's like disturbed that you're killing a human. Like, so maybe they chose to overlook it and say, well, that's just what we're going to do today. But to say they didn't realize that was just a norm. I'm just having issues with that because there are things going on today, including abortion, that we don't say that about because we say, no, it's wrong, it's evil, we know it's wrong. I don't know.
I
Help
think
me.
well,
I'm tripping right now.
I think, therefore, what we have to do is acknowledge that, yes, it's true that it was normative in the South in particular to have slaves. That is true. And as long as we use that truth to simply be a truth in and of itself, not an excuse for slavery. Do you see what I mean?
It was normative. So with that, you're telling me
It was normative.
that it was. But is that saying when they did it, they didn't realize it was wrong?
That's what I'm saying we can't do.
Right.
Okay.
I think some might not have. They might have just had the, dare I say, the capitalistic mindset that this is the best way that I can make the most money and, working like that. But I got to believe that there were a lot of people who it just struck them like, this is not right. These are, look, we stand right next to each other. We look the same aside from the tone of our melanin. And why is one a piece of property and one living the high life,
Yeah.
killing the fatted calf?
Yeah. Well said, Ron. Yeah.
Leonard says that is an aggravated response. Concentration camps were accepted in Germany. Is that part molded over?
No, in fact, I really appreciate how Germany's handled what happened in World War II.
Yeah.
Because you know what they do? They say this was wrong, period. Yeah. And they have a number of
Wow.
memorials up to do that.
Right.
They've preserved some of the actual concentration camps. And there's no yeah, but.
Yeah.
There's no, well, you got to understand, the Treaty of Versailles really destroyed their economy, and Hitler was giving them some jobs, and no one says that.
Right.
Because in the scales of history, it was unequivocally wrong. And so all they do is go, yes, that was wrong.
Wow.
And then everybody goes, okay. We struggle to do that here.
Yeah, we do.
We really, really struggle to do that here.
Ray and Willoughby, good morning. You're on the air.
Good morning. I'm a first-time caller.
Hey! Oh, my
Ray.
goodness.
Hey.
Oh, on a Monday even.
Right, on a Monday.
Look at you winning.
All right. I kind of jumped into the middle of this conversation, so I don't really understand the context completely. I believe slavery is completely wrong. But if you look at the Israelites being held in captivity in Egypt for the time that they did, and all of that, so the way that I look at it when I hear this conversation come up is how many of those slaves were exposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ, period. I'm not justifying the actions, but how many of them were saved and were brought over to a country that had the gospel, and how many of them may have had questions when they got close to some of their slave owners of the Bible, and whether or not was the gospel even being presented in Africa at that time when the slaves were put into captivity. So
I understand your question. So what do we do with that? Because it sounds like what you're saying. I don't think you're saying this. It sounds like, well, at the end of the day, it was a good thing because slaves heard about Jesus.
well, all things work together to those who love God, right?
Yes.
All things work together for good for those who love God. So did God use that, knowing that man was going to do that by the hardness of their hearts, and then God was able to take that situation and offer them the gospel of Jesus Christ? Is maybe that how God used that situation? Because apparently it happened. We all know it happened.
Yeah.
Right. No, and I understand your question as well. It points to God's sovereignty, and God is sovereign no matter what, and He does work together all things for good. But do you see how it sounds like what you're saying is, well, it's not so bad because at least they heard about Jesus.
Mm.
That's what it sounds like. I don't think you mean that, but that's what it sounds like when we say that.
No, I don't. But even with all the situations that are taking place in the world now, I think, well, where's the gospel centralized in the middle of that this entire situation? You know.
But all I can think of right away, though, just to tell you, Ray, is because I actually had a chance to go. I've been to Ghana, West Africa twice, which was one of the outposts for the triangle slave trade in this period. Right. And so, literally on the coast is this giant castle where European powers, bought people from the interior of Africa, held them, and then put them on ships and sent them over to America. Oddly enough, right in the center of the castle, if you go inside this castle, in the center of the courtyard, right above where thousands of people were held captive, right across the courtyard from where they put There was a room with a skull and crossbones on it. You can still see it. They would put people in there that were disobedient, like when they were held captive, and they let them just starve to death in there. It was a church.
No.
Like right in the middle. I'm not kidding. It's an actual church. There's a Bible verse on it. You go in, and it's where the people, the Europeans that were there, would go worship. And so, do you see where it's complex? I see what you mean. It's like, yes, people got saved that were slaves.
Right.
But I want to let that be what it is by itself.
Right.
And go, I don't want to limit that. Had that person not been held captive, God could not have reached them in Africa. Does that make sense? Because he did. I mean,
Right.
when missionaries made it to Ethiopia,
Right.
they were surprised to discover there were already churches there.
Right.
So I do appreciate the call. I'm glad you called for the first time, my friend.
Yeah.
Good conversation, nonetheless.
Thank you. All right. Have a good day.
You
You
too,
too.
Ray. Thanks a lot.
Lydia, good morning. You're on the air.
Hello. I'm a first-time caller too. The topic was too much. I couldn't contain myself, so I had to jump in and participate.
Yes,
Good.
please.
I'm an Indian. I'm of Indian ethnicity. I have lived in this country for 16 years, and I always tell people that this country has allowed me to blossom and become the woman I was supposed to become. And I used to fight my culture tooth and nail because there were so many things I used to disagree with the Indian lifestyle. Having said that, it makes me cringe that some people think that there could be benefits from slavery.
Yeah, I understand.
It makes me, it is like, my goodness. It
Yeah.
is like, I remember how I felt as a woman in India. Like, you can't do this. You can't laugh at this time. You can't wear this. You can't walk with your head held high. And I always say to my husband, I could walk on my two hands here and no one will care. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
That's what,
I mean,
yeah.
I have reached my fullest potential as a woman in this country. So to imagine a human being who did not have that right
Yeah.
to live like that, how horrible that is. What if it was the white people who were enslaved and it was the other skin that did that
Yeah.
to the white people? Will the white people be okay with that? I'm so sorry I'm married to a white guy, okay?
Yeah.
That's okay.
So we have this conversation at home all the time, and my children are of mixed race, and they are going to be dark-skinned like me tomorrow. So I say this to my husband all the time. Tomorrow, if we have any racial issues, your children are going to experience them,
Why do you think it is that we struggle so much in America to talk about our scars without excuses?
I think the thing that's coming to my head is I think we don't know how to be bipartisan. We just want to be extremes. Like we want to either be, the politics just invades the worldview that the politics are influenced by. So I always say this to people, the Republicans have a certain worldview and the liberals have a certain worldview, even the philosophy, socialism and capitalism.
Yep.
So it's like and I always say this to people, why are we afraid to use the word argument? Why do we have to use the word discussion? I'm a PhD student, so we have to know how to argue. So I think in America, you see in the British Parliament how they argue, they go back and forth and they do it very respectfully.
And
They
yet
even
with
call
much
each other
entertainment.
out.
Yeah, it's funny,
Yeah,
actually.
it's funny how they all stand up and down, up and down. But we don't know how to do that in America. We are afraid to do that. We are afraid to ruffle feathers. We either want to agree or disagree. We don't want to be bold. Who was the pastor that was killed in Germany during Hitler's reign?
Dietrich Bonhoeffer, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So he stood up against it. So there were people who stood up against different things that they did not agree with. But then I feel sad that we have this philosophy of love it or leave it. No, there is a middle ground. We should not be afraid to discuss that.
Yeah.
We have to learn to agree to disagree. I mean, I am bipartisan. I don't belong to a certain political view, and I challenge my friends on either side. I mean, I cannot agree with killing babies, and I cannot agree with destroying the nature and the resources either. We have to be responsible in both areas.
Right.
So, so I think that's why, and also we have to be self-aware that we have problems. Covering it up, if you cover it up, it's a wound that's festering. But if you pull the wound out and you deal with the wound, then the wound will heal and the scar will cover up. But
Great.
if you just cover up, if you just cover up without healing the wound, then it's going to fester forever. And this country will continue to fester and be afraid to face the, problem. So, I don't know. This is like my 16 years of wanting to share this has come
that
out.
was awesome.
No, I'm so
Yes.
glad you did, Lydia, because I was even grappling with this morning. I tried to write on it like 6 months ago. I just feel like I'm more in the loss of nuance in America, where it's okay to have that middle ground, where you can say, let's just for the sake of argument, I voted for this person, and yet I disagree with this action. Like we can't. It's all or nothing. It's like you say, it's love it or leave it. And so we extrapolate that into history. It's like either you say positive things about America or you hate America. And and that's not biblical. I mean, because again, God made it very clear to us that we're to, that in spite of our best efforts, we're sinners in need of a Savior. And you see that in the lives of so many, even the greatest people that God loved and chose to have his son come through their lineage. Were a disaster when it came to morals.
Yep.
They needed a savior just as much as we do.
I mean, think of the 5 women mentioned in Jesus's lineage.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yes.
They didn't have great histories,
Right.
So God always used, the weak things and made them, because of him we are strong, But the thing is, I'm lately very much into emotional intelligence. And one of the things is self-awareness. If we are not self-aware, we cannot own the problem. So a lot of people are afraid to own up to their weaknesses. They think weakness is, meekness, people are afraid to be meek. But then I think until you admit that you have a problem, there is no growth.
Right. No, I totally agree.
It's a paradox. The seed has to die for it to grow. So you have to own your weakness before something beautiful can come out of it, So I think that is where each individual struggles. So then we struggle as a country because every individual is struggling to own their own weaknesses,
We are. And I think
own
that's
scars.
an area of growth that we need as believers because like as I've heard evangelists say, Ron Hutchcraft's my favorite one. He says the best way to tell God's story is to tell your story, and your story is is sin, repentance, and salvation. Like it's all of those together. It's not just like, hey, Jesus is a great guy, follow him and you'll be saved. It's no. He died for your sins. He knows what they are.
It's just like Paul's story. He was Saul. That's how Paul witnessed. He shared a story of how he was as Saul, and then how he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and then how Jesus changed his life after he became a believer.
That's right.
So you're absolutely right. So without owning the scars, there is no change. But this is a beautiful country. As I said, I love living here. It has allowed me to become who God created me to be. If I had not lived in this country, I would not be who I am and who I'm going to become tomorrow for his glory,
Amen.
But then that's what I love about this country. And then there are other sides I'm coming to see, the problem areas. And so I tell my husband, you know what, this is my country, so I can own the strengths and I can own the weaknesses as well.
Now, how long have you been in the Moody Radio family, Lydia?
Oh, gosh. I think I landed in 2003, and I have been listening to it since then because I lived in Saudi Arabia before I moved to America. So I was so excited that actually on the radio, it was like a Christian radio.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's
that it
cool.
would be, that you could actually listen to it anywhere. So I remember, I think so I've been in the family for like 16 years now.
Praise God. And I have to say, you have a beautiful accent.
Oh, thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Don't you dare
And
try to
I
get
have-
rid of that.
No, not at all. And I have to say that every morning I look forward to what interesting topics you guys are going to discuss today.
Well, thank you, Lydia. I feel like you need to teach a class for me since you're a
Hello.
PhD student and have lived in multiple countries.
Yes.
I've barely moved a few states.
You guys bring interesting perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing in yours, Lydia. God bless you. 440-546-2255. Wow.
Oh, yeah. That was awesome. Teresa in Cleveland, good morning. You're on the air.
Hello, Brian and Janelle. I want to applaud you. I'm a first-time caller.
Oh, that's 3 in a row. What in the world?
Let us applaud you.
No, yeah, we're applauding you. Stop applauding us.
Stop.
Thank you.
Brian.
To applaud you all for your courageous, just the topics that you guys are willing to take on, the controversial. I happen to be African American female, and I have grown up on Moody. I cut my teeth on Moody, and I heard two callers, I believe were white males, and I am so filled with emotion right now. I can't lie to you. I am hurting. And I can tell you that Black and brown people listening were hurting with those statements that were made.
Yeah.
I find that many times our white brothers and sisters are not aware of their own white supremacy. First off the list, Ethiopia is the oldest Christian center in the world.
Yep.
So when you believe that, or when you espouse that as a white male, God had to use slavery to bring Black people to himself, let's just kind of look at the New Testament as Scripture records it. And so the New Testament was in Ethiopia way before it was any place else in the world. Yeah. And so when I think about the things that are said, that is what white people believe. And what they don't understand is that is why there is a mass exodus of African Americans leaving the evangelical church, and it breaks my heart. Having grown up listening to WCRF, I loved it. I heard Uncle Bob.
Oh, yeah.
I grew up with all those things, but I was never represented in those conversations. I just knew that my identity was in Christ, but I didn't really think that God was really interested in Black people. It was just kind of like, oh. And as I grew up and as I got to college and as I began to really be around African Americans who studied the Bible deeply, I couldn't understand why I had never heard on WCRF or on any Christian radio and Moody about my Ethiopian roots, about it being the center. I wanted to say, why did we not say that? And if I'm saying that at 50 years old, I know that my white brothers and sisters are saying, oh my God, I never heard these things.
Yeah.
But let me say this. I walk around in this Black skin every day, and I have to deal with the climate of this country. I'm in a supervisory capacity, and I have to constantly prove myself. And it is a difficult prospect. And as an African American, I don't want to do that on Sunday morning. I'm just be all the way honest.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear a white person say, oh, yeah, we saved your souls. We were doing you a favor. Or I don't want to hear someone say, well, abortion is really the worst thing ever. I mean, if you really study slavery, biblical slavery was nothing like what was practiced here in the States. It was horrific. It was rape. It was horrible. I mean, when you think about taking a pregnant woman, hanging her and cutting a baby out of her to scare your slaves, study Willie Lynch. So when you try to minimize slavery for us, you shut us down. Listen, sin is sin. And the enemy is using the hue of our skin to divide us. But I need my white brothers and sisters to accept the truth. They are more concerned with us making them comfortable than confronting the truth. Jesus said he was the way, the truth, and the life. He says in the Old Testament, come, let us reason together. Though your sins be as scarlet, I'll make them as white as snow. God has some conditions about us, and he confronts us, and we must agree, yes, it is sin. sin. It is selfishness. And like you said, no what ifs. When we come to him, I say, God, I blew this thing all the way. I messed it up. And if it had not been for your blood that you shed, I would be damned to hell. I would go to a godless eternity. And until we're willing to call wrong, wrong. Yes, I love the Gettysburg Address. Okay, it is I love the essence of what is in that document. But I don't need him to be perfect for me to say, I can respect who you were, but y'all did some wrong stuff. Similarly to how I feel about my parents. I love my parents, but they flawed. And in their best, they gave me Jesus, and I'm grateful for that. But they don't have to be perfect for me to love them. And when I look at my white brothers and sisters, it's like they're saying, don't bother my idols. Don't touch him. I love Robert E. Lee. Don't touch Gettysburg. That's all perfect. And I'm like, no, it's flawed. When we look over our past, some horrible things were done. And we are allowing that now. And I want to tell all of my brothers and sisters that are listening that sometimes we have elevated a white supremacist mindset that has nothing to do with the gospel. And it's shame on us. And so if you want to know why black people don't feel comfortable coming to your church on Sunday, it's because of the comments like, hey, we saved your souls. Hey, like we extra. Now, when you see Germany saying this is wrong, the reason why Germany can say it's wrong is because white skin is accepted and brown and black is not. And so our skin in this country, the reason why white people cannot say, I'm sorry, without giving a disclaimer, is because there is no value placed on black and brown skin. It is somehow like, we helped y'all, you're extra, we included you, we'll indulge you, we'll tolerate you. And as long as that mentality is lying at the root of your heart, don't think for a minute African Americans don't. I can tell you a lot of my friends stopped listening to WCRF because they were like, I can't relate on any level other than the gospel. And then I got to sit and listen to the gospel and spit out these.
You know what, Teresa? You're starting to break up, and it's breaking my heart. I was trying to get out of your way here because your call was starting to break up, Teresa. Don't you be sorry. Thank you for your honesty and your passion on this. And
thank you, Brian, and thank you for sharing these topics because they push us, they provoke us, and I think if it provokes us towards love, and if it provokes us to a point of repentance, then good. If it agitates us, I hope all day long we agitated with this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do I, Teresa. And
in the bathing suit.
You know, we use the word family for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that our hearts here on the show is that we remind people in Northeast Ohio that the family at WCRF is of all tribes, tongues, and nations.
Yep. And
that the family's also got some drama, you know?
Yeah. Don't we all? Neville's got some drama.
And the best way to move forward is to deal with some of the drama.
That's what family is. That's right.
So I hope that through the ministry God's got us doing here that you feel part of our family, Teresa.
Yeah.
I do. And I want to thank you because I did not for a long time, but we all get a chance to evolve, right?
Yeah.
I haven't always been where I was.
Yeah.
So I thank you, and I thank you, and I thank you, and God bless you. Because even though people aren't calling in, they are listening.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for making the show better today. We love you too, Teresa. Thanks so much for the call. Live radio.
Man.
People wonder why I love live radio sometimes. This is it. We don't write a script. We just pray and we let the Lord guide us where we're going to go. We came in today.
Yeah.
Sorry, no, we just came in today and you were like, hey, I was in Philadelphia this weekend. I saw something pretty cool that I wanted to talk about. And it was, how cool is it that right there in the center of Philadelphia, right by the Liberty Bell, right by Independence Hall, is now remembering actually that there was something nasty that happened there, which was President Washington had 9 slaves right there.
And I love listening to the last callers, just the spirit and passion makes me think of we need people like that to speak up, because what I saw, the slave quarters of President George Washington's home, happened and was exposed, and I know about it because of people like her. You know, there were activists and African Americans and just activists in general that pushed back at the memorial and said, no, like, we need to expose the whole history, the whole truth. And they kept pushing back for several years, and it made this possible. Even the whole, which was my favorite, the mural where they list the names of the 9 slaves, which to my children, they've struggled, and I can share this later as we've talked about slavery. But to my children, it reminded them and affirmed them. These were human beings. These were people. It humanized them. And so, yeah, I love talking about this, because it reflects my struggle with why are we so afraid to expose the entirety of our history as a country, as we celebrate our founding fathers, speaking the truth. And like she said, we should do this in family members, with our grandparents, our parents.
Well, I mean, but it feels unpatriotic, right?
Yeah, it does. It does. But why? If we as Christians, Christ followers, more than the world, acknowledge the need for us to see our own sin and the sin of others, that's the gospel.
It really is at its core the gospel. And it's easy to forget that the
we should
gospel,
be the first ones to do that.
Well, right, yeah, because the gospel should remind us that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us.
Mm-hmm.
Like, our story is one of sin.
Yeah.
Yep.
And we cannot excuse it. There aren't any sins where God goes, well, that one's not so bad because I knew what you meant.
Yeah.
No, they all sins. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and we are deserving of hell, but Christ died for us anyway. So that said, that's how we can even approach our history in a way where I think it's easy to say, like Lydia did, that tension of,
yes.
She was like, listen, I love American India. I couldn't be a person. I was a woman, and that's all that really mattered, was I was suppressed as a woman. And now I get to be the woman God made me to be in America. Mm-hmm. And yet she's like, I can't figure out what's wrong with you people. Why can't you see that there's still bad stuff too?
Yes. Any country you go to.
Yes. And I mean, even your family's story, right?
Yes.
You came to America because of the wonderful things about it.
Yes. And we love this country.
But it doesn't mean that there aren't any bad things.
Right. And it would be disingenuous and dishonest to ignore them, right? Just like we don't do that in the Bible when we talk about David, etc. Scott in Edinburgh, good morning. You're on the air.
Good morning. I got to tell you guys, I appreciate the conversation today, because I have gone like 3 different directions in my thought process listening to you. My first thought was, as an American, one of the things I love about our country, and this is my impression, is that it's not about who your parents were, who your grandparents were, what line, who are you? I'm going to hold you accountable for whoever you are and whether you are a good man or not. But listening to Lydia challenge me in my viewpoint that, well, you know what, there are stuff that we need to talk about and discuss to understand it. And then the third line of theme too was I think the why it's so amplified right now is we have such tension in the country. And as soon as you start bringing things that delicate, it starts pulling on those tensions. And so the amplified tensions are already out there. So it feels like people are just trying to pull us apart. But if we're not willing to have these difficult discussions, even if we disagree, we're not going to move forward. So I appreciate it, because you guys, like I said, took me 3 different directions.
Yeah.
No, and I love hearing about kind of your meta-analysis there, because that's what we're trying to accomplish here, is that we want to be that place where we can safely have difficult discussions to model that, because this is what Christ followers must do, to try to grapple with the truth of the gospel and the truth of how to live our lives and be his ambassadors. It ought to take us down. When we hear someone's perspective that's a believer like Lydia, we go, I didn't think about it that way.
Yeah.
Maybe I should. Or you hear Teresa's passion and her thoughts as well about history and faith, and you go, wow, she made a great point. Maybe that changes my thinking here.
When you initially started, my back kind of rose up like, wait a minute. Why am I still having to make account for ancestors over 100 years ago that I had no relations to? I'm a German ancestry. My family's only been in the country 80, 90 years. Why am I having to make account for? And that's initially where I started. But you guys took me, like I said, through the discussion several different routes. So I appreciate it.
Hey, thank you. That really helps, Scott, understand, your end of it as we talk about these things. Because my story, quite frankly, is very similar. As far as I can tell, my earliest Dahlin ancestors came like 1880s or so.
Yeah.
So I could be the guy that raises my hand and says, well, I'm not going to participate in this slavery discussion because that was over by the time.
Yeah.
No. Because right now I'm living in a society that was created and as a result of those decisions.
Right.
And so I see the complexities of it, the benefits of it.
You can learn from it, because even I use this example because it really touched him. As my oldest son, learned about Alexander the Great. That is way back. It's not even this country. But intellectually speaking, we were able to talk about the complexities. For him as a man, my son was like, oh my goodness, this man was a genius, like in terms of his strategies, military strategies, and just the things he accomplished. But I love that I was able to be there with him and also look at like, wow, he was like, the things he did were so evil. And like, some of the things he did were horrible. We can handle all of that in the same conversation.
Which is why we do
and it helps us, like we brought it to today, like, man, who do we know around us? Like, can we still celebrate this person and know, like, whoa, that was messed up what you did, but you're a genius in this area. And what can I pull and learn from you and reject? How can I learn from your mistakes?
But that's that exercise I love so much when teaching history is hero or villain. You take a guy like King David, and I think when the scales of history are weighed, he was a hero.
Yeah.
With many flaws. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, you're never going to find, if you believe the Bible, which we do, you're never going to find a flawless hero.
Never, ever.
What you're going to find
long enough with a person. Yeah.
What you're going to find in your hero is someone who needed Jesus just as much as you do, if not more. Which means they've got horrible sin. Mm-hmm. And the heroes that we don't know much about their sin, it's a matter of time.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't be deflated by it, because it just amplifies the truth of the gospel that while we were yet sinners, all of us, Christ died for us. And that's where salvation comes from, not from our works, because our works are terrible.
Vicki and Butler, what's your take on this?
Good morning.
Hey.
I wish I could just give Teresa a big hug and tell her that, everybody doesn't think that way.
Yeah.
Everybody doesn't devalue people of color. Some people have grown up without that bias.
Yes.
And as much as I can appreciate, and we need to know what's happened in history, the main reason we need to know is not to repeat it, and to be more sensitive, to be understanding that we're all God's children, and we all need to be there for each other, and that history was horrifying. It is inexcusable, but we need to move forward. And I am so sad about how many the problems still in this country. How many Black and brown people are in prison without due process? How many people who are unarmed are killed by the police every year? And most of all, how many people who came here for a better life are in these horrible internment camps, sleeping on the ground and on concrete with inadequate food, given a wet wipe every 3 or 4 days to wash up with. I would take these people into my home if I could. I think that it's so important to understand that history has its real horrifying moments, but we need to do something. I am really afraid of our president right now. And the things
I'm just
going to
jump in right here,
country.
Vicki. We love you so much. Thank you for your call. We work super hard to remain nonpartisan, so I'm just gonna jump in at that point. God bless you. Thank you for your passion on that. And you're right. And it actually kind of goes with a text. Somebody was also bold in saying, Shirley texted and said, please don't lump all white people together as thinking we are supremacists. General assumptions may not be helpful. Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right. I don't know what to say about that other than I feel like Ron and I are the white guys around trying to be the ones that say, no, we're not all like that. And yet I don't want that to become a yeah, but.
Right. Because the longer I dwell in discussions like this, the more I see things about me that I don't like, that I need to change.
Yeah.
So it's uncomfortable, yes, but it's going to make me a better person and a better Christian by going through that discomfort and saying, you know, I need to peel this layer off, and I need to make these changes.
And maybe that's part of the fear that maybe you can speak on, Brian. A lot of people don't like going here or don't like talking about it because they feel guilty. They feel like, well, I'm not that. So they try to avoid it. I'm a part of a group at my church on racial diversity, and we tackle a lot of these things. There's almost 50-50 black and white. It's really awesome. And we went there. They were like, why is it that white people don't like talking about racism overall? Like this, a blanket statement. And some of the white brothers and sisters at my church were saying when they listen to their families and friends, what they feel, and some of them sympathize it, it's like you feel guilty. You feel like you're being held responsible, you know, or accountable for things you didn't even do. So what would you say? How do you, because you don't feel uncomfortable, how do you handle it?
Well, I understand that feeling, and I think it's true in a sense, and that's our natural defensiveness. And I guess my best response would be here during a live show to that difficult issue.
Yeah,
the best response would be I typically say, "Look, they're not talking to you."
Mm-hmm.
Like the person who texted and said, "We can't lump all white people in it," and go, "Yeah, you're right." But isn't it funny how we always assume someone's talking about us?
Mm-hmm.
Like if when Teresa called and Teresa was talking about just certain attitudes people have and things people say, I didn't think she was talking to me.
Yeah.
So why do we do that? Right? I mean, why would someone in your diverse church group dealing with race issues presume that the bad person is them? I don't make that presumption. I mean, I have flaws I need to address, but
yeah.
I also think it's difficult for us to acknowledge the truth that the past follows us into the present. We want to believe we can compartmentalize the past. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So like we want to believe, well, slavery was in the past, civil rights movement was in the past. It's not in the present. Therefore, stop talking about it.
Right.
And that's an inherent problem because we are the product of our past.
Right.
Like Sarah and I spent so much time in our marriage relationship trying to understand our relationship together in light of who we were, how we were raised.
True.
Like we are ultimately how I handle conflict, how I handle joys, sorrows, everything, trials is a reflection of how my parents taught me to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a reflection of how their parents taught them.
Mm-hmm.
And so my history is inextricably part of me.
It is.
And therefore
right.
the society in which I live, whether we like it or not, is a reflection of our past and a product of our past.
A couple of texts, and the last caller said the same thing also. She said a few things that were very valid that are going on today. But she also said, let's move, when we talked about the things of the past, she said, why don't we just move on? How do you do both? Can you do both? Can you move on and say, we got enough issues going on right now?
I get that desire.
Even if it's,
I've heard that
she's
before.
acknowledging racial issues today, but she's saying, let's move on from the one from the past.
And this is hard
Are
for me
they
to-
even separate?
No, they're not separate.
No.
And this is hard for me to speak to because the harsh reality is this. I want to move on, but I can't until I acknowledge there was a hurt.
Mm-hmm.
My best analogy I can give for this, and I've given this before privately with people when I try to talk about this in my awakening of sorts living on the south side of Chicago for many years in an African-American community, it would be if my wife came to me and said she was hurting about something, I wouldn't tell her, can we just move on?
Yeah.
Part of the healing, even if I wasn't the person responsible for it, would be me just going, you know what, honey, I love you and you're hurt. And I'm sorry you're hurt. And what happened to you wasn't okay.
And no matter how long, you know, she'd come back to you day after day for years expressing this hurt, you would not get to a point where you'd be like, look, we've talked about this, move on. you'd still
Why
be
wouldn't
like,
you say that to Dana?
because I love her and I know she's hurting. I don't want her to hurt. I want to, like we always say, I want to make my wife happy, and I can't make her happy if she's hurting. So I want to do whatever I can to help her.
But Ron, you didn't do it. Why can't you just get over it? It's not your fault. You see how callous that sounds? And yet, as Christians, we cannot forget that we're adopted into the family of God. And so therefore, our fellow believers are our family.
Right.
Would you do that to your sister?
No.
Ron, you've got a sister.
Yeah.
If your sister was hurting and she came to you and said, this painful thing happened to me and it hurts, would you tell her, can we just stop talking about it?
No.
You wouldn't be able to move forward in your relationship with your sister until you stopped and said, that's horrible.
Right.
And I'm sorry that happened. And perhaps that's why we're stuck, is because far too many people are ready to move on before we've fully acknowledged. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's no black and white, bullet points that say, this is what you do. You have to say these words, whatever the process is to acknowledge and heal. It's not laid out in concrete terms. So
it's messy. Yeah.
Yeah. We're still working how to even do that.
What do you think about this? Is kind of what Ron is saying. Someone texted and said, if white brothers and sisters in Christ would speak up in large numbers, the racism in this country would be quickly turned because the quietness of good people allows it to continue. Kind of reminds me of Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Yeah.
Michael in Cleveland, good morning. You're on the air.
Hello. I often hear this idea that as white people, we need to apologize for what happened in the past. And I was reading One Race, One Blood by John Perkins.
Yes.
I was leading an youth group study with that, and I was having this feeling that, I don't get to take credit for the accomplishments of my ancestors, and in the same way, I shouldn't have to apologize for it. But in the same token, that being because my identity isn't in the color of my skin, yet my identity is in Christ. And with that in mind, I think we as the church, it's not me as a white person that should apologize and that, but me as a Christian, the racism is a stain on the church. And Pastor Perkins goes through and talks about lament and what that looks like. And I think that's the angle that I kind of have come to look at, that it's not really me as a white person that should apologize, but the view of the church has been tainted, and I have a responsibility to give people the right view of what the church should look like.
Well, and he's a great writer, John Perkins, and part of the civil rights movement, a great guy. I would add only one small twist to that, Michael. I'm curious to know your thoughts on this. I think there's a distinct difference between me saying I'm sorry and me being sorry. Mm-hmm. As in, I didn't do any of I wasn't on the Edmund Pettus Bridge with a billy club trying to kill people that were crossing it during the civil rights movement. So I don't need to be personally sorry for that because I didn't do it. Mm-hmm. However, I can be sorry and say, wow, that's horrible. I'm so sorry that happened. Yeah. It was wrong. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So maybe it's more of a perception on my part of how I'm hearing the being sorry or something.
Yeah, I don't know why, and this is not you, but I don't know why people take it such personal offense. When for me, it's not a personal offense, but it's still me going, wow, this is wrong. I'm so sorry that happened.
Yeah. Period.
Not, but I didn't do it.
Hey, hold up. Where are you going? You know you liked your time with us. You want more. So look down, hit that button right there, subscribe, and you'll get updated episodes, and then you can hang some more.
And guess what? You can help us. How? A 5-star rating. Not 4, 3, 2, 1. No, 5.
You can also hang with us live, weekdays 6 to 9 a.m. Interact with us, talk with us. Download the Moody Radio app.
Or at brianandjanelle.org.
And we don't put all this together all by ourselves. There's some great people behind all this production. We want to thank Ron Eastwood, Kelly Ryder, Paul Carter, Doug Hayner, and our awesome and fearless leader, Josue Villa.
And finally, this podcast is a production of Moody Radio in Cleveland, the ministry of Moody Bible Institute.
Well, Brian, that's a wrap.
Yep.